so much. Man, what an incredible community. I have been so struck by everything that I've seen over the past couple of days. Incredible speakers, incredible people. I've met so many of you. Really, really honored to be part of it. So yes, I'm Sophie. I'm here to talk about content design at The New Yorker. I'm going to take just a moment to provide a little bit of background. Who is this lady who's talking to you? I've spent the past few years in New York building content design teams. So I currently am working with The New Yorker. I was the first content designer there. Before The New Yorker, I was at InVision, where I was the first content designer there. Does anyone remember InVision from the pre-Figma days? And even before that, I was at Lyft, which is basically an American competitor to Uber. We will touch back on Lyft in just a moment. But for today, we are going to be talking about content design, what it is, why it matters. I'm also very aware of the fact that most companies do not have a dedicated content designer. They don't have a specialist in this discipline. So I'm going to work to provide you with some best practices, some takeaways that you can start to apply right as soon as you get back to work. And finally, we'll talk about some results through the lens of The New Yorker specifically. So The New Yorker, if you're unfamiliar, is a weekly publication. It's been around for quite some time, since 1925. And it's a pretty New York-centric print magazine. This is the very first issue ever, featuring Eustace Tilley, our mascot of sorts, on its very first cover. And The New Yorker is basically known for the quality of its journalism, really in-depth articles, 10,000-word pieces published as a collection every single week. We cover quite a lot of social commentary, so what's going on in today's news, how does that impact you? We also publish weekly fiction featuring, I think, some of the best authors of each generation. Murakami is a personal favorite. And we balance it all out, of course, with humor, with cartoons, with satire. And The New Yorker, in particular, is known for having quite a loyal subscriber base. It has quite a loyal fan base, readers that have followed the publication for decades or generations. So a lot of our role as product designers and content designers is to help shepherd those readers along into the digital age. We launched a website in 2001, an iOS app in 2016, Android just last year. And a lot of what we're doing is basically saying, hey, we're going to go beyond just putting the magazine on the internet and try and offer new and interesting ways for you to engage in our journalism. So as a content designer, really a lot of my work is to answer this question. How does the voice of a magazine that's been honed over a century exist in something like an interface? And I realize that there's quite a lot of weight to this role. I'm not creating a voice or a product from scratch. And our users often know, or our readers often know, this voice even better than I do. So I'm answering questions every day like, how do we explain a new augmented reality feature? Is like a cartoon appropriate on an unsubscribed page? How do we make this all feel authentic to our users without coming across like Steve Buscemi trying to hang out with the cool kids? I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. I'm going to backtrack and go back to our actual first focus of this session, which is, like, what is content design? What am I talking about when I say content design? And you might be familiar with a couple of different terms when I say the phrase content design. Some folks refer to it as UX writing. More recently, in the past few years, much of the industry has moved into calling us content designers. I do see the irony in being people who name things being pretty bad at naming themselves. But we've been shifting toward the term content designers because it helps really ground what we do in design. We do much more than just put words into text boxes. So if you'd like to talk more about this kind of evolution from calling ourselves UX writers to content designers, please come find me at a break. I will talk about this to no end. But when it comes to defining content design, I normally refer to this definition: the practice of defining useful content that guides users through digital experiences. So let's break this down a little bit. Content design is a practice. It really is the only form of writing or content design that takes place before a feature or a product is complete. It really spans every single phase of the design process when it's done well. Content design is also specific to useful language, not quite yet, which means that we are not focused on selling or splashiness. Really, language is the most complex form of communication we have. It takes quite a lot to understand what something like a sentence or a phrase means. It's much more efficient to communicate through something like motion or color. So when we need to communicate through words, we really need to make sure that that language is useful, and that's where we come in. And finally, content designers are focused on guiding users through their digital experiences. So we are focused on ensuring that the user is put first and that the language is action-oriented. We are helping them complete the task at hand with minimal friction. So in other words, content design helps the product and the user understand one another and communicate with one another. Or in other words, we're essentially designers who look at features through slightly more of a written lens than a visual one. So I mentioned earlier that content designers work on the language that is designed along with the feature itself. It's really one of the only forms of writing that takes place before a feature is complete, which makes it different than something like a technical writer or a copywriter. Just to break that down a little bit more, content designers typically sit on product design teams. We are working mostly in Figma, and we're really focused on designing how the user moves through an experience. That's different than something like a marketing copywriter who's sitting on a creative or a marketing team, and they're really focused on announcing a feature or a product once it's complete. Hey, use this thing. Finally, this differs from something like a technical writer who typically sits closer to like an engineering team, and they're mostly focused on explaining a feature. This is how it works to more of an internal audience. So this is what content design is and what content designers do when it comes to their day-to-day. But when it comes to good content design, I typically refer to something like a hierarchy of needs, where you have to work your way up the pyramid from one level to the next. So at the very bottom of the pyramid, you have useful. If your UX content is not useful, none of the rest of this pyramid matters. Because at the end of the day, you need to be able to justify every single character on the screen as being essential and providing value. We are working with very small amounts of real estate here, as we all know. Phone screens, sometimes watch interfaces. Once you've achieved that useful level, then you can move up to clarity. If your language is not clear, nothing else is going to matter to that user. And we normally achieve this by asking millions of questions so that the user doesn't have to. We work to achieve that layperson's language so that the user isn't stuck trying to understand what we're saying to them. Once your message is clear, then you can start to think about things like consistency and concision. Consistency is essential when it comes to content design. This is where you can really throw a lot of what you learned in like English academia classes out the window, because repetition is a good thing. In content design, in interfaces, different words imply different actions, even if they're synonyms. So it's essential to stick with the same phrase throughout. If you say sign in on one screen, switching it up, switching to login, or between continue and next, really only confuses the user. Finally, concision helps us work with the limited real estate that we have, but never by sacrificing clarity. And above all, at the very, very top, we have those branded moments that really only work if we've achieved the other levels below them. Because if you haven't achieved clarity, if your copy isn't useful, if your user doesn't understand what they need to do next, they are not going to care about a pun. And when done well, UX copy, content design, is typically so natural, so efficient, that you don't even notice it on the screen, unless you are very intentionally working to foster a bit of human connection. So let's take a look at a couple of examples. I mentioned Lyft at the beginning. So here are two apps, Uber and Lyft. They're both accomplishing the same exact thing. You let the app know where you want to go, they'll send a car your way. They are asking for the same exact information in two different ways. And so this is a way of providing an example of how content design choices can lead to a different experience. Uber is global. They go with something pretty slick, pretty direct. Where to? Where do you need to go? Similar to Uber, slick, direct. Uber also, because they operate globally, likely needs to localize this language into quite a lot of different languages. Lyft, on the other hand, only operates in English-speaking countries. It's a much more personable brand, a little bit more playful. So they personalize. They use my first name here. Hey there, Sophie. Where are you going? They can be a little bit more verbose, and they really lean into the personality of the brand. The more that you learn about content design, the more you see that there are dozens of decisions being made on this screen. The choice to supplement a shortcut and the language accompanying it with something like an icon. How much information do we need to provide for the user to understand which shortcut we're referring to? And so on and so forth. And as you go through your digital experiences, you see that there are millions of these choices being made, even on something as simple as a sign-in screen. And without UX copy, many of the interfaces that we see every single day are not only useless, but nearly unrecognizable. Even with UX copy, many of our experiences are equally useless, like with these modals that are plagued with jargon, like with these experiences where you're not entirely sure if you're canceling the modal or the order. And of course, we've all seen these terrible secondary CTAs, these deceptive patterns. No, I don't eat healthy food. So, of course, usefulness is essential to any product. But the power of great content design goes beyond just usability. So there's this really great book called Because Internet by Gretchen McCulloch that talks about this, that talks about how the internet has changed written language maybe faster than ever before. And content design is built for this new medium, where long-form writing just won't do anymore. It accounts for the fact that a sentence often looks like a paragraph on a mobile screen, and that every single character really needs to deserve the valuable real estate that it takes up. Content design reaches beyond just basic literacy, beyond just the ability to communicate through written word, and it infuses strategy into every single word to drive action, which then leads to better products that proactively reduce friction and answer to user needs, which then lead to better user experiences, leading to more loyal users, fewer support tickets, and finally, better brands. Now, there's quite a lot of opportunity here. Your users then start to recognize you. You build trust, you build credibility, you build a relationship with them, which leads them to come back over and over and over again. So there's clearly a good amount of opportunity here. Now let's start to talk about how you can put this into practice by creating a process of your own. So I do think it's important to note that we are not jumping straight into the writing here. There is quite a lot of work that takes place underneath the surface. So we'll take just a classic example of a few steps that you'd follow as you're designing a new feature. This example is from Stanford University's design school, where the design team would normally move from conducting maybe a little bit of research into starting to map out maybe what their wireframes, what their user journey looks like, into some polish, maybe some testing. And most teams start somewhere like this, where you've made your way most of the way through this process, and then you start to think about really polishing the language. OK, what words are we putting into these text boxes? Is this the right word? But you're leaving quite a lot of opportunity on the table. And once you start implementing content design, things start to look a little bit more like this. Because a line of copy is rarely ever just a line of copy. There is a wealth of context that you gain by starting to think about the language and how you're going to be communicating complicated concepts to your users much earlier on in your design process. So you can start maybe crafting a word bank as you're conducting research, starting to pull some of the language that you're hearing your users use. You can start to ensure that a screen is designed with the content in mind. It starts to really create this feeling, creating this situation where the words and the visual design are created in tandem. So all of this sounds great. Again, how do we actually apply this? How do we actually take this home today? So we are going to zoom in on a very tiny little content design ask and model how it makes its way through this process. So, an example. Let's say we are designing a success message for the New Yorker's cartoon caption contest with clear next steps. Your user has taken an action. They want to make sure that it went through successfully and what they should be doing next. The New Yorker's cartoon caption contest is something that takes place every week. We basically offer up a cartoon, and it's in need of a caption. So in this situation, we have, I think, 2 aliens looking at a mall directory map. It's a cartoon. There's no punchline. What exactly is the joke here? So we ask our readers, how would you label this cartoon? Every week, you vote on the winners, and we go from there. So let's say that we've looked at this cartoon, and you've come up with a caption. Maybe something like this. Wait, was it conquer them all or conquer them all? You're like, all right, pretty good. Let's submit. So you go through, you submit your caption, and you're left in this place. Was it submitted? What do I do now? Did I win? That's where we come in. So we'd start to dive into this design process. Maybe we start by mapping out where exactly our users are. Where are they coming from? Where do they need to go to next? What information do we need to provide? At this point, along with maybe some of that thinking, that research that you might be doing, you can start to take a look at the language itself. So you start to create something like a word bank. Maybe you have a chance to chat with some users. You're going, hey, what words are they using as they're talking to us? If you have access to support tickets, that is a great way to see literally, exactly, verbatim what your users are saying. Maybe you're looking at some competitors. What do others in the space use? What do our other products use? Can we be consistent there? In most cases, you don't want to be inventing new terminology when your user already has a pretty clear mental model in mind. You then start to define the flow. Where are my users coming from? Where are they going next? What does that journey look like? What is that conversation between basically the user and the product? Which is why it can be helpful to literally map out a conversation between your user and the product. So this is an approach that I borrowed from Sarah Culver. She created the UX writing team at Slack. She has since moved over to Figma. So this was an example that she drafted when they were working on a journey where users wanted to archive a bunch of channels. On the left is the Slack interface. So I heard you want to archive some channels. Which ones? Just the inactive ones. And you'd like to exclude any our CEO is in. So this is a really helpful way to start to understand the flow of information. What's the order of events here? How can we use a bit of progressive disclosure to provide the information that our user is looking for? Also, importantly, what's the tone that we should be using? Are these friends? Is this more of an authoritative relationship? And how much information do we need to pack in at every single step of the flow? So if we take our example, our success state for the cartoon caption contest, it might look something like this. On the left, we have the New Yorker. We received your submission. Thanks. What now? So the user is immediately wondering what they should do next. Readers vote on it. You'll see the results next week. Can I do anything else in the meantime? Sure thing. You can vote on last week's captions. So we see that we basically have 3 pieces of information that we need to cover here. 1 is your submission was received. 2, readers are going to vote on it. You'll have to wait till next week. 3 is that in the meantime, there is another action that you can take. How are we going to fit all of this information into one journey? That's yet to be sorted out, but we at least know what information we're working with. So now we have quite a lot of context to pull from. We have our word bank from that early exploration. We have an understanding of the amount of information that we need to be painting out. And then we maybe move into ideation. We start to wireframe. We start to dig into maybe some lo-fi copy, low-fidelity copy. And I don't think that lorem ipsum is quite as pervasive as it was a few years ago, but this is where I stand on my soapbox and I say if there's one thing that you can do to take back to your team, it's to ban lorem ipsum. So here we'll see the importance of starting to draft copy even when you're in these early stages of wireframing. When your designs are in quite early stages, your copy should be too. So really easy rule to implement to ensure that you're designing the words and the visuals together. It's the advice that I give to every team without a content designer. So you'll want to mock up what something like this interface or what this screen might look like. This is an example that I always show from Biz Sanford, who was at Shopify for quite some time. And this shows the difference of using lo-fi copy to essentially sketch with words and the difference that it creates. On the left here, yes, there are words on the screen, but we're essentially just labeling what these sections are. On the right, we see what happens when you actually put lo-fi, yes, not perfect, draft copy that represents how much information you'll need to convey on something like a pricing page. You see how much longer it is. You see that you actually need 4 modules to represent the different benefits. You'll see how much information you need to squeeze into each of these pricing cards and how that impacts the design in turn. So for our example, we start to mock up some options. Again, not perfect copy, this is draft, but you start to see what we're working with here. Maybe on the left, we go, okay, maybe we'll need like a headline, a sub-headline, some body text, a couple of buttons. That seems about right. Maybe it's like a pop-up modal. They can close it to go back to the contest. You start to mock up some of the words here, and you see that's a lot of language for something that is a relatively simple concept. Maybe we don't need to be so intrusive. Maybe this can be just a banner that appears on the screen. Can we communicate all of this information using just a couple of lines of text? You start to dig into that pyramid. Is it useful? Is it clear? Can we really lean into concision here? So this is the interplay. This is the trade-off that you start to see. Maybe you're talking with your team, you're taking a closer look at it, and you go, I think we can go with the less intrusive option. I think we can go pretty concise with this one. So you start to move forward from there, and you already start to see how the words start to impact the design when they're considered nice and early on. What happens with a lot of scenarios is maybe you go with the design on the left without mocking up the words, and then once you've already gotten pretty far along in your process, you're starting to come up with more words to pack in there to fill the space, when in reality, you could have gone with something a bit more concise. Now, I've made it to prototyping stage, which is basically where you take your low fidelity copy and start to polish. You start to bring it into higher fidelity. And in order to do that, you'll need to know how to write high fidelity copy. So we'll start to dig into best practices for the actual writing part of UX writing or content design. And I'd like to point out here that as we're taking this detour into the writing part of content design, we are on slide 52 of this presentation before we've gotten to the words. There is so much to do, so much to dig into before we get to the very tip of the iceberg, which is the actual writing part of content design. So we're going to take a detour into a bunch of best practices that you can take home today. First is jargon, the curse of knowledge. A situation where maybe you as a developer, as a designer, as a product manager are writing things like error messages. You know what a Boolean operation is. Your user probably doesn't. Even if they do, even if they're a power user, ideally, if your business is going well, you always have new users that may not understand this technical jargon. So when in doubt, please work to translate your language. It's often not dumbing down your language. It's often one of the hardest things to do. Simplifying the language, making it as easy to understand as possible for the layperson. Next is error messages, often copy that's forgotten quite often. Error messages are tricky because your user is usually already in an elevated emotional state. They're usually pretty frustrated already. So there are a few things that we can do to try and de-escalate the situation. I recommend avoiding emotional language like sorry or apologies, and really keeping it direct, focusing on specifying exactly what has gone wrong as concisely as possible, but again, never sacrificing that clarity. And whenever possible, providing a direct link to a fix with really clear anchor text so your user knows exactly where they're going, avoiding click here. Once we have our language sorted out, we can start to think about things like sentence structure, being active in our language, avoiding passivity. So here on the left, the user needs to read the entire sentence to understand what we're communicating here. On the right, even if they only make it through the first 3 words, they've got it. I have gone through like the 7 stages of grief and acceptance around the fact that no one reads. So we can design around it. We can get to a place where if even with users who are only skimming the first 3 words, they still are able to use this message. Let's get nerdy for a second. I love talking about punctuation. When it comes to punctuation, the thing that I will always point out is ampersands. Ampersands, really great way to shorten a word even further, right? Concision, always a good thing. Ampersands tend to draw the most amount of attention to the least important word in your sentence, which is and. Exclamation points should be used for exclamations. When they're used too frequently, it often can come across as inauthentic or disingenuous. And when it comes to things like semicolons, em-dashes, fancy punctuation, if you're using them, please know that you'll need to defend them to your death. Make sure that if you're using them, you can really ensure that you're using them correctly. Otherwise, they risk being a little distracting to your users. I'll get into a little bit of capitalization, also a hot topic for the word people amongst us. There are really 2 common sorts of capitalization if you are not going in the direction of just straight all caps. Sentence case is where you basically capitalize the first word of the phrase. It's really easy to implement. It's seen as often a bit more approachable, but it does also lack the sort of gravitas that something like title case does, where you're capitalizing most of the words in the phrase. Title case is really best for short phrases because it causes your user's eye to jump up and down, but it does do a better job of standing out in context. Really, the takeaway here is there isn't a best form of capitalization. The best thing that you can do is be consistent. If you're using title case for all of your buttons, you're using title case for all of your buttons. It keeps it nice and easy, nice and consistent. One last tip here, again, repetition. So when you're going through a journey, different words, again, have different meanings. So keeping it really simple for your user and for yourself goes a long way. If your headline says sign in, sticking with sign in helps reassure the user that that is the same action that they're taking, as opposed to switching to something like login midway through. OK, that's my soapbox. I will get down off of it. Now let's get back to our process, where we're basically taking our lo-fi copy, pushing it into something that's a bit more high fidelity. We are going to think back to all of the best practices that we've talked about over the course of this talk. We are going back through the pyramid that we've established. We've ensured that every single word on the screen is useful. It's something that the user needs to know. We're expressing it clearly. We're not selling. We're not providing splashiness. From there, we start to think about things like consistency. If we say sign in at the start, are we saying sign in the entire way through? Concision, are we using the fewest number of words possible? Are we being nice and concise so that the user, even if they're just skimming, will get the takeaways that we discussed? And finally, only if this is a scenario where maybe it won't intrude on the clarity or the concision of this experience, only if we've reached the pinnacle of this pyramid, we can start to talk about adding a little bit of a branded touch, maybe a quip, maybe some fun language, some playfulness, only in these rare situations. We are thinking back through the best practices that we discussed when it came to the language itself. Your content is free of jargon. You've translated everything. It's really easy for a layperson to understand. It's actionable. The user knows what they need to do next. You're using nice active language. It's punctuated simply, and it's helpful, especially in error states. So maybe we go back to that draft that we had and start to take a look through it with these ideas in mind. We maybe take a look at this second sentence and see, I don't know if we need this fancy em-dash. It might be a little bit distracting to the user. Do we actually need to break this out into essentially 2 sentences that are connected? Or can we shorten it a bit more? Can we lean into concision without losing some of that clarity? I think we can. So we decide to shorten it even further. And we finally make it to the final step that we'll go over for today, which is putting our copy to the test. So this is a question that I get a lot. How do you test UX copy? And there are, of course, a number of different ways to go about this. The one that I like to recommend that's nice and simple is a highlighter test, where you highlight helpful words in green, confusing words in yellow, and useless words in red. So put your language in front of a user, or maybe a colleague if you aren't able to get some user research accounted for at this stage, and see what they say. Maybe after looking through your language, they say, I'm not really sure what next week means. Is that like Sunday? Is that in 7 days? I'm not really sure what this duration means. Maybe captions feels a little bit unnecessary. Can we shorten this call to action even further? And you maybe land on something like this on the right, where we're being really specific about those next steps. They know exactly when they should come back and check for the results. They know exactly what will happen if they click on this link, but it's still as concise, as skimmable, and the least intrusive that it possibly can be. And we're feeling pretty confident about this copy. We've gotten to this place, it's been researched, it's gone through quite a lot of thought, a few rounds of drafts, it's been tested. And we've made it all the way through the process that we laid out for ourselves at the start, from our initial phases, through lo-fi, through hi-fi copy. And I mean, the reality of the situation is there are always a million more steps that we can go through: QA, analyzing metrics, iterating from there. The journey, never really ends. The iterative nature is really at the heart of everything that we do. But this should get us off to a good start. The one additional step that I like to talk about is documentation, because this is yet another simple way that you can start to bring content design into your day-to-day, even without a dedicated team, by creating a style guide. So specifically when it comes to our work at The New Yorker, if you're familiar with the publication, we make some interesting style guide choices. We still capitalize words like internet and web. We use the diaresis above the second vowel in words with a double vowel. There's a lot going on here. So when it came to our digital presence, we wanted to be sure to maintain that house style, that personality, through our digital interfaces as well. So this really came through when we were creating our style guide. It all needed to start from the product itself, from the brand itself. So we always start from the style guides that are already in existence. In our case, we had quite an old one that we wanted to be true to, that we wanted to pay homage to. But in most companies, there are writers across the company. There are folks in support, in legal, marketing. Reaching out to those folks across the company allows you to create a really consistent voice from those first touch points that they may have with a marketing activation, all the way through the product, through support, and so on and so forth. So connecting with those other writers and creating a cohesive style guide across the company is really a great first step. It also allows you to get a little step forward. You're not creating this voice from scratch. And then from there, you can build, really focusing on the digital aspect of this. So as soon as you get back to your day-to-day, really the first thing that you can do is just open a Word document and start to jot down the language that you use consistently, that you've identified already. Pretty easy to do. If you see that you do hyphenate the word email, for example, maybe that's something that you're always having to correct as builds are going out the door, jot it down. It's documented, it becomes part of your house style, it becomes something that's easier to implement on an everyday basis. If you have specific components, if you're a design system person, building out copy guidelines for your components is also a great way to provide that sort of consistency. Do you capitalize the first word of maybe a link or a button? Do you bold phrases that you'd like users to click on? Do you use periods at the end of them? And so on and so forth. Jotting these sorts of things down, documenting them, is a great first step toward having a unified product voice. Of course, there's also the flip side of the coin, which is breaking the rules, figuring out when you should go against the grain. And really, at this point, across the content design community, we do have quite a lot of great resources. If this is something that's interesting to you, I'd recommend all of these books and many more. Yes, you know the best practices. Yes, you read the books. Yes, you are the one who's advocating for all of this in your day-to-day at your company. But equally as important as knowing best practices is knowing which best practices are best for you. So especially at a place that has quite a distinct voice, we constantly are questioning these best practices to ensure that at the end of the day, authenticity is shining through, even if it means that we are spelling a word like ensure with an I for the sake of sticking to our house style guide. So we'll see some of this shine through the lens of The New Yorker in some of the work that we have launched over the past few years. One example that I always point to in our iOS app is an audio offering. And this is a good example of a number of different things. Both the amount of language, the amount of space that we have to work with, often a single button that we're communicating that you've already started listening to this audio, and you have a certain number of minutes remaining. Once you get to this middle screen, you see that this is a screen that has no copy at all on the page, and how big of a part this is of the content design work that we do. Again, words are the most complex and slowest form of communication that we have. So for something like a native audio player that's pretty easily recognizable, we lean into iconography. We don't need a single word on this page, and that is a content design decision as well. Finally, getting on the right here, you see how it all works together. We have the added challenge of working amongst editorial content. There are a lot of words on the page, so maintaining that consistent voice is even more essential. Another example is a fiction module on the homepage. We had to communicate that this was an archival collection. This is not new public information. This is not a new piece. We communicated that Alice Munro is an author that has contributed to The New Yorker for decades. She has quite a lot of work, and that this is only a selection of those stories. So what we had to work with was the header in the top left from the fiction archives, more by this author on the top right, and the two words selected stories. You see how I think 8 words are doing quite a lot of heavy lifting and really fading into the background so that the user is noticing the author and their work first. Another fun piece of work was for the puzzles and games department. We have quite a lot of offerings. A crossword puzzle is one of them, where we needed to communicate not only the difficulty of a puzzle, but also its frequency, that it's available every day. So we decided to use a combination of words, color, and illustration to communicate those different attributes of each puzzle. You can see that the owl gets increasingly panicked as you go along, as the puzzles get more and more difficult. You can see that the colors demonstrate the day of the week that the puzzle is available, and of course that's all reinforced with language, but in this case the language is secondary. A couple of more examples. Name Drop, another trivia game that we created in partnership with the Puzzles and Games department, shows the importance of that collaboration between all types of writers across a company, where we work with the creative department to come up with the name of the puzzle itself, or the name of the game, Name Drop, a tagline, and then as you make your way through, we spent so much time writing out instructions for a trivia game. People need to know instructions for a new trivia game. And then we got to the point where we realized that no one reads instructions. Again, panic, 7 stages of grief. So decided to enter in basically a splash screen that appears at the start of the game that flashes the most important takeaways that you need to know in order to play what is a relatively simple game. You have 100 seconds and up to 6 clues to provide one answer. A couple of last examples here. Notifications, everyone's favorite and least favorite topic. Working with the editorial team to both name the different types of notifications that we offer, group them into categories, and also at the top here, offer the option to pause all of your notifications with a single tap. A huge win for users that we were able to push for. Yes, of course, there's the ability to unpause in just a tap as well, but starting to really balance out what we're offering, both in terms of offering more content and also less. A favorite little detail here of mine was deciding to put the apostrophe on the other side of the S, referring to multiple editors' picks, was something that took, I think, 2 hours of discussion to get to that point. And finally, an example of just a little bit of that branded moment. The landing page, the splash screen for our iOS app. Not something that interferes with your ability to use the app. not something that you see for a long amount of time every single day, but a tiny moment where we were able to insert a little bit of that playfulness. Not only are we letting the user know that we're loading the top stories, but also referring to some of the well-known brand attributes of The New Yorker: cartoon captioning, doodling, fact-checking, just to reassure them that regardless of any of the new technologies, the new screens, the new touch points that we're offering, it is still always The New Yorker behind the screen. Thank you.